Direct power purchase agreements are now one of the hottest topics in the Vietnam solar market, and we are pleased to welcome the expert in this field, Mr. Gary Zieff, to introduce us with the DPPA program mechanism in Vietnam for the following session. Mr. Gary Zieff is an accomplished renewable energy expert with over 19 years experience in emerging and established energy markets. Gary is currently serving as Principal Energy Advisor of USAID, a VD program, a 5-year high visibility program assisting Vietnam's MOIT to establish an effective policy, regulatory, and incentive environment for low emission energy growth. Gary leads collaboration with MOIT and ERAV to design and develop a DPPA pilot program. Let's give a big welcome to Mr. Gary Zieff.
Shaheen, thank you very much. Neo Ventures, it's a pleasure to be here and to participate in the APAC Solar Energy Digital Event 2020. I'm delighted to share my experience working on the direct power purchase agreement in Vietnam. It's been an exciting journey in working with the government of Vietnam, and I'm excited to share the work that we've been doing with you all today. And certainly as questions come up, I know this is just a pre-recorded speech, but as questions come up, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'd love to share any additional information or answer any questions on the program. The government of Vietnam and U.S. Agency for International Development's Vietnam Low Emissions Energy Program, VLEAP, are jointly piloting a direct power purchase agreement, a DPPA mechanism that enables large industrial power consumers to access renewable energy while also encouraging new investment in renewable energy. This new power procurement mechanism will strengthen Vietnam's energy security, expand the role of renewable energy in Vietnam's power mix, relieve the government's fiscal burden of meeting renewable energy goals, and encourage more foreign direct investment for sustainability-oriented corporations. The DPPA pilot program will also accelerate the development of the competitive electricity market in Vietnam by providing an early opportunity to understand the operational requirements of direct access and bilateral power transactions. By initiating a pilot program, limited in scale, the government of Vietnam can increase all stakeholders' understanding of and comfort with building, buying, transmitting, and maintaining renewable energy in Vietnam. The government of Vietnam has been encouraging uptake of renewable energy, most notably through the renewable energy feed-in tariffs for at least the past 3 years. This mechanism has enabled, the feed-in tariff mechanism, has enabled nearly 5 gigawatts of new renewable energy projects to be built based on a 20-year fixed price for each megawatt hour delivered, or in this case, kilowatt hour. However, responding to the appeals of major multinational corporations in Vietnam, the Electricity Regulatory Authority of Vietnam, ERAV, has been working with USAID to develop a mechanism that will allow direct attributable access to renewable energy through a direct power purchase agreement. Historically, power procurement in Vietnam has been based on one-on-one negotiations with developers under a build-own transfer or IPP, something of this nature, and EBN. But as the government of Vietnam moves towards a competitive retail market, DPPAs can act as a stepping stone towards open competition. DPPAs, as many of you are probably aware, are long-term contracts under which an off-taker, typically a commercial or, in the case of this program, an industrial power consumer, purchases electricity directly from a power generation company, a GenCo, under a bilateral PPA, or in the case of this pilot program, a CFD. And in this case, this a well-designed DPPA pilot policy for renewable power can benefit consumers, project developers, and governments. DPPAs allow power consumers to meet their sustainability commitments, which is probably the #1 issue, hedge against energy price increases, lower upfront capital requirements to meet these commitments or to hedge prices, and ensure long-term price certainty. DPPAs also allow renewable energy generators to access additional creditworthy off-takers, lock in long-term off-take arrangements, improve project bankability, reduce operational risks via the associated DPPA policies. And for government's benefit, DPPAs allow the government, in this case, the government of Vietnam, to enable direct renewable energy procurement by large energy consumers, support Vietnam's renewable energy development targets, reduce the fiscal liability of long-term renewable energy purchase agreements under a feed-in tariff program, demonstrate renewable energy policy leadership, and support the transition to a competitive retail market. Now, in order to choose the most suitable DPPA framework for Vietnam, VLEAP conducted a detailed review based on the following key building blocks. We looked at a legal and institutional review within the government, within the power market in Vietnam. We reviewed and recommended, we looked at various DPPA models and reviewed and selected the models we recommended based on what we understood to be the market in Vietnam. And we looked at the roadmap for a DPPA pilot program to use it to test the preferred model for suitability within Vietnam. VLEAP also conducted extensive analysis of each of these models to understand the full impact on each of the power sector stakeholders. VLEAP engaged with both the Energy Regulatory Authority of Vietnam, ERAV, as well as private developers and consumers to identify DPPA approaches suitable for the Vietnam market and the regulatory conditions. That is, the selected model had to be aligned with policy and regulatory priorities. And while a DPPA policy pilot would enable bilateral renewable energy power purchase agreements, it also had to maintain alignment with the overall power sector and the regulatory policies. It had to have limited detrimental financial impacts on the power market. And it had to be well suited to market conditions and operator needs, as well as to be attractive to both investors and consumers. In addition, the model had to align with Vietnam's existing and future power market design and local operation, be reflective of stakeholder inputs, and in order to accomplish this, VLEAP consulted extensively with the related stakeholders, including ERAV and the various Vietnam power market sector working group, in order to find a best fit DPPA model, as well as the private sector through our renewable energy buyers working group quarterly meetings. In addition, it had to be fairly easy to implement, and that's a complicated concept, and have limited additional operational work for the power sector agencies. And finally, in order to accommodate the various complexities of Vietnam law, it had to limit the changes in Vietnam law and limit requirements for new or modified regulations. Based on these conditions, VLEAP worked with ERAV to design a pilot program with the following goals. The following goals. One of the main goals was to test the DPPA mechanism in a controlled manner. So prior to full acceptance and rollout, the pilot program had to be controlled enough to allow for potential changes in the program, as well as ensure that there would not be significant disruption to the power market. In addition, one of the goals was that it had to be designed to develop capabilities of the power sector agencies to deliver functionality required to implement the DPPA mechanism and eventually the competitive retail market. I think ERAV would agree that this was a competent stepping stone towards a competitive retail market. In addition, it had to identify and correct, there had to be the ability to identify and correct any deficiencies in the design prior to committing a significant amount of time and energy or resources to a full-scale DPPA pilot program. The pilot program also had to confirm the market demand and the willingness to pay and participate by large power consumers in Vietnam. This was important. This was important in order to show that there was significant market demand within Vietnam in order to manage the amount of resources that have been put into place to put together this pilot program. This also had to build credibility for a DPPA mechanism that it's aligned with the overall development of the VWEB, the wholesale market, the Vietnam wholesale electricity market, and provide a pathway to a zero emissions electricity that many corporate consumers desire. And finally, a well-established program had to create a more accurate costing for the related services for power generation and delivery to support the DPPA pilot program and further develop of the competitive electricity market. And of the DPPA options that USAID, that VLEAP USAID reviewed, ERAV determined that a synthetic or a virtual DPPA model, where a consumer and a GenCo enter into a price swap agreement, market volatility, was the most appropriate for Vietnam's conditions and priorities. In addition, this virtual DPPA model fit very well into the wholesale market, which started as of 2019 and used the wholesale market as a basis, as a foundation for the transaction. Excuse me. ERAV selected this model given the wholesale electricity market's start of operations I mentioned in 2019. And MOIT, in addition, MOIT wanted to add liquidity to the wholesale market operations. So through extensive analysis, VLEAP was able to determine that the synthetic option improved the overall net economic benefit for most stakeholders and market participants. And this further aligned with ERAV and MOIT's goals to ensure that there was no detrimental financial impact against the power market and the power market sectors. Now, while the CFD requires new functional responsibilities to be borne in various capacities by EVN, EPTC, NLDC, and the Power Corps, the responsibilities required, for example, the hourly metering of the GenCos or a database of maintenance, being able to apply credits to invoices and bills, et cetera. These kinds of activities are well within the institutional and technical capabilities of the power authorities concerned. So the DPPA, and in addition, the DPPA charge, which we'll get to in a moment, further compensates the power authorities for these extra responsibilities and these extra costs and burdens that they would incur in implementing a DPPA mechanism. And most importantly, the DPPA allows for preliminary operations that will lead to the competitive retail market, which is a very important element to consider if you're the government of Vietnam and you're moving from a competitive wholesale market or a wholesale spot market to a competitive retail market. In addition, the synthetic DPPA framework, while complex, requires minimal adjustments or carve-out to existing Vietnam law. And this is also its significance. We did extensive research and analysis on the current legal situation, and as determined by the legal advisors to the program, there was minimal adjustments or necessary carve-outs to existing Vietnam electricity laws, and the ability for MOIT or the Prime Minister, for that matter, to implement such a decision. And a decision for the DPPA in accordance with those existing legal frameworks and will not necessitate separate policy justifications. Now, while that's true, the tax treatment of the synthetic options may introduce additional complexity, particularly as relates to accounting for the consumers, and certainly will require several key terms and conditions to be included in the CFD to avoid triggering a VAT recovery mechanism. But depending on how the tax authorities view the financial derivative and the nature of this transaction, we don't believe that they will have significant complications regarding the CFD. Additionally, and most important to MOIT is that the DPPA supports Prime Minister Decision number 63 for the transition to the competitive retail market by attracting capital investment to invest in the power market and gradually reduce state investment, which ensures competitiveness, fairness, equality, and transparency. It will continue the electricity price reform according to the roadmap to finalize the retail electricity market, the competitive retail electricity market, add liquidity and functionality to the wholesale market, attract new customers to the retail electricity market, and as importantly, unbundle the various costs associated with transmission, distribution, ancillary services, and system market operations. This allows the PC to shift the bulk supply tariff to a blended from the bulk supply tariff, and this is also fairly important, to shift from the bulk supply tariff to a blend of transmission and distribution charges and generation costs. This unbundling performs two functions. First, it determines the cost recovery fee, which the pilot we've identified, or the pilot has identified as the DPPA charge. And two, it serves as the necessary step to move the market towards the competitive retail market. Now, within the pilot program, the DPPA charge serves three main purposes. First, it ensures that the consumers participating in the DPPA pilot pay their fair share of system-wide costs. And that's important to understand. When customers, and in this case, under this pilot program, customers have access to the spot market for 100% of their consumption. The spot market does not have any of the elements that are included in the retail costs, which are transmission, distribution, SMO fees, ancillary services, all of the elements that I've mentioned before. And so in order to provide a cost recovery mechanism, the DPPA charge was developed so that, again, the DPPA pilot program participants pay their fair share of those system-wide costs. Second, the charge compensates the power sector agencies for all of the operating costs and that they will incur in implementing a DPPA pilot program. And third, as mentioned earlier, the charge anticipates the evolution of the Vietnam competitive retail market. And these are very important elements to the DPPA charge. There was a lot of work that was conducted to ensure that they were calculated accurately, that the concept is fair and equitable, and that there's no egregious charges that would be added to it in terms of trying to look at what the opportunity might be within the DPPA pilot. And each of those cost components will be estimated based on MOIT decisions as well as detailed EVN instructions, which means those are would be overseen by the power sector to ensure that they are accurate. Now, ERAV has agreed that the market demand substantiated a program size of up to 1 gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts, with individual project sizes to be above 30 megawatts AC, and that's a direct element of the Circular 45 on the Vietnam wholesale market rules. The pilot framework allows for the consumer and the RE Genco to enter into a commercial CFD agreement, a commercial contract for differences agreement, which would be commercially negotiated bilaterally between the Genco and the consumer, and which determines the amount of power transacted, the strike price for that power, so the unit price for each unit of power delivered, and the relevant terms and conditions such as default remedy, termination, arbitration, all of these elements. Those are commercially negotiated between the parties directly. There is no template that is required for the CFD as dictated by the government of Vietnam. So that's a pretty good opportunity for the Genco and the consumer to enter into and negotiate as they see fit. In addition, consumers can be a single entity or a consortium of consumers, which also means that the generators, the Gencos, are able to look at either single entities or multiple consumers to make up and take over all of the power that they're generating. And finally, one other element that's important to note is if there are multiple consumers, or even if there's a single consumer, a GenCo is able to redirect that amount of power to another consumer if the original consumer CFD is terminated for whatever reason. Now, the renewable energy generator will enter into a government of Vietnam drafted power purchase agreement, and the counterpart to that agreement will be EVN EPTC. Finally, the consumer will enter into a market buyer power supply agreement with their local power corp for purchase of 100% of their power, but pegged at spot market price, plus the requisite DPPA charge we discussed earlier. And this agreement will also be drafted by ERAF, MOIT. And as I mentioned, that's an immediate discount that the consumers will be enjoying from their retail pricing. Project applicants will be required to submit an application and meet certain criteria, including but not limited to proof that the consumer is a tariffed existing industrial customer taking service at 22 kV or higher. It will also include a proposed project, which must be included in the PDP. The consumer must also have stated sustainability commitments and show progress towards those commitments. And the consumer will also need to agree to offset at least 70% of their consumption under the DPPA. The current perception of bankability of the DPPA pilot program will also be tested during the implementation of the pilot program. Most renewable energy projects, as many of you are aware, are financed using project finance, which relies on the creditworthiness of the off-taker. And in this case, they would be the consumer of the CFD and the cash flows from the two revenue streams. The revenue stream that the consumer is paying under the CFD, as well as the revenue stream from the spot market, the wholesale market, to repay the debt. Now, in addition, project finance also allows for limited or no recourse to the equity owners of the project. So if the project fails to generate enough cash flow to pay the debt, the owner, the equity owner, is not liable back to the lender. It's a very difficult process to go through, and the lenders in this case are very diligent, often very diligent, about ensuring that the projects are with appropriate creditworthy off-takers, and that there's a sufficient amount of protections and guarantees within the underlying agreements to mitigate any renewable energy project risks during the project development, as well as the construction phases and of course the operation phases. And this diligence includes focusing on these underlying agreements and the counterparties to those agreements. In this case, these agreements are the CFD and the PPA, as I mentioned earlier. And the developer will go to great lengths to ensure that there are adequate protections against risk of default. So to enable them to reassure lenders that these underlying agreements are sufficient, are leading practices, and that there's sufficient protections within them to the debt provider. And in turn, allow them to secure competitively priced debt. So the reason that developers often go to the difficulties and complexities of securing project finance is that it is often very low priced. The interest rates are low relative to other types of debt that are available to project developers, and therefore allows them to either take a bigger spread in the profit between their payback interest and the price that they're charging the off-taker for the power. So banks typically look at the creditworthiness of the off-taker, the protections within the CFD and the PPA, and a metric called debt service coverage ratio, or debt service coverage. And that allows them to review the bankability of the project. So as I mentioned, banks take great care to review the CFD and the PPA to confirm that there is sufficient, not just sufficient debt service coverage, which is their main metric to review, but also that there's sufficient risk mitigants in place to protect that cash flow and to ensure that their investment is protected. And this also ensures the repayment of the loan, and lenders must validate that the project will be able to generate that cash flow to repay the loan with interest in a timely manner. In addition, banks price in risk by increasing, again, as I mentioned earlier, increasing that cost of capital, or just simply refusing to lend to projects that have PPA terms that are, or conditions that are too risky. The current status of the pilot is that the MOIT Vice Minister has received Prime Minister Notice number 710, and that was delivered in June, directing MOIT to approve and direct the pilot DPPA program implementation. VLEAP continues to collaborate with ERAV, delivering activities per an agreed upon work plan in order to develop the MOIT decision on the pilot program. And while some delays are expected, particularly given the focus on the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the complexities of working through a pilot program within a power sector that is in transition itself, and the resulting procedural constraints, the government of Vietnam and the Prime Minister's office have both indicated that it intends to move forward with a pilot program within the year. Once the decision is signed, applicants will have to submit projects within regulated timeframe to be considered for inclusion in the pilot. Pre-planning is right now underway for an applicants conference and a launch event to support preparation for submission. And currently under review by GVN, Government of Vietnam, are the transaction agreements, the web-based one-stop shop for all relevant DPPA pilot program information, and the applicable forms. Excuse me. Up until the end of last year, VLEAP has been working in collaboration with ERAV to determine the appropriate criteria, the framework, pilot program policies in anticipation of a full pilot implementation. As I mentioned earlier, it is now expected that the legal approval will be released by the end of this year with a Q1, Q2 2021 program start. Once the MOIT decision is released, there's a sequence of activities that have been mandated by the decision. For example, within 15 working days of the release, MOIT will officially announce the start of the DPPA pilot program. After the announcement, but before the web portal is open, MOIT/ERAV, in collaboration with VLEAP, will conduct an applicant conference to socialize the DPPA pilot program with the interested applicants and present the application process. Within 30 days of the MOIT decision, MOIT will open the web portal, which contains relevant information on the DPPA pilot program, will allow a download of relevant documents, including the application, as well as allow an upload of the application. Completed application will be due within 75 working days from the initial MOIT decision, and MOIT will announce the selected projects within 45 days. Finally, within 390 working days, so it's over a year, of the initial MOIT decision, projects are expected to begin commercial operation. Post-COD, MOIT and ERAV and VLEAP will lead a monitoring and evaluation process to oversee the pilot program. Excuse me. Data collection through the entire program will support a review of all aspects to propose adjustments to improve the effectiveness of the mechanism and potentially implement a second phase. I will stop here, but I will leave you with the idea that ERAV MOIT is working diligently to ensure that a pilot program is announced and signed into law by the end of this year, again with a 2021 start date. And in preparation of that, we look forward to hearing from all private parties who are interested in participating in the DPPA pilot program. My email is available through Neo Ventures. I am open and willing and able to see and receive and respond to all email inquiries, and happy to to talk further about the DPPA pilot program. We're very excited by it. We've been working a long time with ERAB in collaboration with ERAB and MOIT, and very excited to begin this. Thank you very much. Thank you, Neo Ventures. It's been a pleasure to be here tonight.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gary Zieff, for such informative sharing. And now let's take a rest for about 30 minutes, and we will be back again with a panel discussion on the topic of rooftop solar at around 11 o'clock Singapore time. Thank you, everyone, and thank you again, Mr. Gary. Okay.